99 million tons of snow fall on New York in the greatest storm of its recorded history. The 15-hour precipitation catches the great city unawares and gradually puts the big town in a deep freeze.
Here is why people rode the train to Florida, because look at the ocean out there. There's the sun and the beach and the ocean. People going down to the resorts in the winter.
Henry Plant was a fascinating man, and he's certainly someone that history should remember.
Flagler was very interested in creating the new port of the South.
But before any of that could happen, Florida had to be reinvented, and that took vision. Imagination is nothing new in Florida, but it didn't begin with theme parks. It started in the late 19th century with some extraordinary people who saw the potential that others missed.
But it was a very wild place. I mean, there were thousands, literally tens of thousands of alligators there. Every body of water would contain a lot of alligators. So it wasn't a very safe place for settlers and pioneers to inhabit.
Florida was the least populated state east of the Mississippi. You can think of it as the southern extension of the American frontier. It was a wild place.
No, I think one example of how Jurassic Florida was how people got to Florida before the railroads. They would sail from New York, for example, to Jacksonville on a steamer, and then get a stern wheeler down the St. Johns River, which was about a 200-mile journey, would take 36 to 40 hours. It'd shoot alligators, of course, because they might get tangled up in the paddle wheels of the steamer, but they'd shoot egrets, they'd shoot anything that moved on the shorelines. It was a massacre of the wild, of the innocents, as they say.
One of the things that kept Northerners from coming to Florida was fear of tropical diseases, malaria and especially yellow fever. Nobody knew what caused it. There was no cure for these diseases. And so people stayed away, except in the wintertime.
Yeah, I mean, they got over the fear of the wildness of Florida. The major driver to attract real settlers into Florida, rather than just tourists and visitors, was citrus. And Florida was a very good climate for oranges, and land was cheap, particularly land near lakes where you had the necessary muck. So you didn't have to fertilize the citrus groves. The citrus would grow naturally.
It was a race. In the days when oranges had to be transported by ship, by sailing ship, you would pick the oranges when they were green, pack them up in barrels, put them on a ship, and send them north to Philadelphia or New York City or Boston and hope that they would get there before they spoiled. Now, the railroads changed the equation.
Railroads were great. They opened up Florida, they connected communities, they helped establish new settlements, and they avoided long treks to get from A to B via horse and buggy. The early railroads, I'm talking now in the decade of the 1880s, which was the period of intense growth for railroads, across the nation, by the way, but particularly in Florida. But it was driven almost entirely by citrus.
As late as 1885, tiny Rhode Island and Delaware were the only eastern states with fewer miles of railroad than Florida. Citrus would begin to change that, and as Florida became a little more settled, its agreeable winter climate became better known. Medical science still hadn't isolated the cause of tropical diseases, but it was known that they weren't much of an issue in the cooler months. And so tourists began coming in greater numbers by the 1880s, aided by the railroad construction boom. Steam and steel rolled back the Florida frontier, just as they had done in the American West.